Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's June 22nd, 2024. I'm Jeff. Joining me is my co-host, Ness. What do you got for us this week, Ness?
I'd like to talk about Thomas Sowell's concept. I think it's a very useful heuristic of, it was also the title of a book, White Liberals and Black Rednecks. And the TLDR thesis there is that on a lot of social issues and social orientations, the sense of like honor culture and the way that interpersonal interactions are viewed, gender differences, sexual differences in behavior and roles, and all of these different sorts of aspects of culture as it manifests itself in the United States and in the West more generally, that on a spectrum from left to right, there are white liberals on the left, white conservatives in the middle, and then blacks on the right. Although they vote Democratic and self-describe as liberal on so many issues, their orientation is more conservative than that of white Republicans, who are relatively moderate on the scale of the country more broadly. One salient example of that phenomenon would be in the mid to late aughts, when the same-sex marriage debate was raging, before same-sex marriage being almost universally accepted in the West became a fait accompli. Before that, when it was still something that was up for argument, and votes like in California, the famous Proposition 8 in California, where blacks who are overwhelmingly Democrat voted more strongly than any other group in opposition to Proposition 8. And so I think that framework is useful in understanding what happened last week with Pew Research Center. Pew Research is a center-left organization, but one that has in my experience, well-deserved reputation for being honest and straightforward and reporting the data as they gather it, or at least that had been the case up here until recently. Reading from NBC News, the Pew Research Center's revised a report after it received criticism for saying a majority of black Americans believe, quote, racial conspiracy theories, unquote, about U.S. institutions. In the report released June 10th, titled, quote, most black Americans believe racial conspiracy theories about U.S. institutions, unquote, Pew detailed the suspicions that black adults might have about the actions of U.S. institutions based on their personal and collective historical experiences with racial discrimination. Survey respondents highlighted issues such as discrimination in the medical field, incarceration, and guns and drugs in black communities. So far, all well and good. But here's where the rub is. The report's initial title prompted swift backlash from critics who said, quote, racial conspiracy theories, unquote, implied that black Americans' distrust of U.S. institutions is irrational and without historical context. In response to this, Pew pulled the report and then revised what it presented publicly, and it changed several of the wordings of the questions, but it didn't change the underlying data that was used to collect those responses in the first place, thus rendering the findings corrupted. If I ask you how much you spend purchasing Budweiser products each week and whether you'd like to spend more or less than that each week, and you tell me you spend $50 a week and you would like to spend less, and I report that as you saying that you think that Budweiser is an evil corporation that is trying to steal your money based on your genetic propensity for alcoholism, then the figures I present are obviously nonsense because they don't correspond to the questions that are being asked. And that's what's happening in this case. There were questions that were asked in a certain way, and then they were being reported as though they were asked in a different way to avoid cultural criticism. Fortunately, there is some history of the demographic differences in propensity to believe, quote, conspiracy theories, unquote. And so we'll look at one from a generation ago and then another one that was released just days after the blow up with Pew occurred by The Economist and YouGov. In 1997, in the city of Chicago in Illinois, SDA, the same interface that hosts the General Social Survey results for public consumption, asked over 700 black Chicagoans to either agree or disagree with the following statement, quote, historically, it is correct that Jews were a major factor in financing and organizing the slave trade in the 17th and 18th centuries, unquote. 35% of black respondents agreed with that. It goes without saying that that would be an assertion that would be absolutely verboten in any institutional power center in modern America. There'd be forced public apologies, and then there'd be defenestration, and that would be the end of whoever made the assertion's career. Black Chicagoans were also asked, quote, "It may be a little extreme to describe Jews as bloodsuckers, but there's a lot of truth to it all the same," end quote, and asked respondents to either agree or disagree with that question, and some 34%, so just over a third, again, agreed with the sentiment that Jews are, quote, bloodsuckers, unquote. A lot of time has passed between then and now, and there would never be questions directed at blacks about Jewish behavior. All of that, the animosity and the hostility that existed between blacks and Jews has mostly been papered over, and the villains have been replaced by generic whites. And so the things that were anti-Semitic conspiracy theories 25 years ago are now just white supremacy, white fragility, systemic oppression, etc., etc. Moving now to the current year, I alluded to earlier the Economist YouGov poll that was released just days after the revised Pew Research survey results came out. But this one isn't going to draw any ire in the same way that the Pew Research one did, because this is a survey of the general population. It's broken down in the crosstabs of the survey by race and age and partisan affiliation, but that's not the top line result. And so it won't garner any attention, and so it won't be talked about, but it is worth looking at because it shows the same tendency for blacks to be on one end of the spectrum when it comes to conspiracy theories. And a note about that term, it's obviously intended to be derogatory, even though the quip about the difference between a conspiracy theory and the truth is 6 months has never rung more true than it has in the past 3 or 4 years in the Western world. But in terms of status, believing in these conspiracy theories is coded as a bad thing to do, something that is negative, has detrimental effect on one's status and one's presumed intellectual capacities and moral worth as well. The reprobate believe this stuff, the resplendent do not. And so the so-called conspiracy theories here are that antidepressants are to blame for school shootings, that 5G cellular networks are being used for mass surveillance, that the CIA was involved in the assassination of John F. Kennedy, that the U.S. is to blame for Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and that vaccines have been shown to cause autism. And so with the potential exception of the question about JFK's assassination, these things are all of these questions are clearly coded as something that you should say no to, that if you want to have high status. Unsurprisingly, then, Republicans and Trump voters are more likely to agree with all of the conspiracies and say that all of them are true, far more likely than Democrats and Biden voters are. However, blacks are more likely than any other group on 4 out of the 5 conspiracy theory questions, with the exception of the JFK assassination, than either white Republicans, it's somewhat redundant, or white Democrats are. And the split between white Democrats and blacks is especially enormous, even though it's not broken up, or broken down, I should say, in the crosstabs, because we see that among, for example, the question of 5G cellular networks being used for mass surveillance, we see that just 5% of Biden voters say that it's definitely true, while 19% of blacks say that it's definitely true, and just 7% of whites say it's definitely true. And of course, in that Biden contingent, Biden voters, probably 20% of that contingent is black. And so that's pulling that number up to 5%. It would be lower than that if blacks, who, again, 19% say that's probably true, if they weren't included, it would have been probably 3 or 4%. And so you can see, and Trump voters are at 14% saying it's definitely true. So you have 5% of Biden voters saying it's definitely true, 14% of Trump voters saying it's definitely true, and 19% of blacks saying it's definitely true. Again, that Biden number, even at just 5%, is inflated and pulled up by the 19% of blacks saying that it's definitely true. And so that roundabout gets us back to the heuristic of white liberals and black rednecks, and we see it perfectly here in this survey data, where white liberals are on one side, white conservatives are in the middle, and blacks, who are overwhelmingly liberal and democratic, are on the other side, the far other side, far opposite from the left white liberals. the ones we called Swipples in a better age. Pivoting a little bit, since we're talking about survey data and blacks, we'll see if we can slay another sacred cow here with the assertion, the uncritical assertion that blacks in modern America suffer from low self-esteem and a society that constantly tells them that they're not enough, that they can't do it, that they aren't trusted, et cetera, et cetera. Well, if society is telling them that, they are telling themselves something very different. The Economist YouGov poll that was conducted in mid-June that we've been referencing here asked respondents if they would say, in high school, do you think most people you knew would have said that you were, quote, very cool? And just 10% of whites said that they would be described that way. 19% of Hispanics did, and 22% of blacks has said that other people in school would describe them as very cool. And the percentages for those who would be described as not cool at all, so the losers, the nerds, the wallflowers, 14% of whites just said that they would be described that way. Just 7% of blacks did, and 5% of Hispanics. So it looks like the self-esteem issues here, at least as they were perceived through the lens of time, show that blacks and to a lesser extent Hispanics have higher self-esteem than whites, who have the lowest self-esteem of these three groups. On the other hand, that was then and this is now, and they were shielded somewhat from systemic prejudice and white supremacy and everything else when they were in the confines, the safe confines of the public school system back when they were in high school. What about now? Well, Economist YouGov asked respondents about their coolness now as well, and 16% of whites described themselves as, or said that people who knew them would describe them as very cool. 22% of Hispanics said people who knew them would describe them as very cool, and 30% of blacks did. So here we see again blacks twice as likely to be described as very cool than whites. And among the percentages who would be described as not cool at all, 8% of whites, just 3% of blacks, and 4% of Hispanics.
Hearing all this survey data makes me think of a recent example of Cori Bush talking about her magical healing powers. I'm going to play that clip. Cori Bush is a congressperson from St. Louis, Missouri, and she's a black Democrat.
And this lady came to us and she had these tumors. I mean, she wanted us to feel them. And I just remember I put my hand on her and my hand just began to move. And the lumps that were there were no longer there. And she was so happy and she went on about her day. And I never saw her again.
So you think the tumors disappeared?
I do.
Man, Jeff, that is the perfect contemporary example of this phenomenon playing out in real life, because you have this white liberal woman fully ensconced in the corporate media power structure asking a black woman who is on the left about something that just imagine, if you can, imagine instead of her interviewing Cori Bush, she was interviewing, say, Marjorie Taylor Greene. And Marjorie Taylor Greene said the same thing. Do you think that the reaction would be in the same universe? The accepting reaction, the totally non-critical follow-up question, or would it have been immediate pushback and incredulity? And so I think this exchange illustrates that Sowell's observation about white liberals and black rednecks. It's veracious. It exists. It's the truth, but it is a very inconvenient truth, and so it's glossed over. And so in a situation like this, when you have the white liberal and the black redneck, the white liberal kind of looks around nervously and hopes that no one will notice what's going on because it's very embarrassing. And the puppet masters behind the scene will make a mental note about not putting Cori Bush in a position where she will be able to let the intellectual vacuity slip, the mask slip again in the future, but otherwise she won't be punished at all. Whereas, again, if it was somebody like Marjorie Taylor Greene, then there would be immediate pushback and there would be follow-up reports about how her story was not able to be verified and how she is pushing for a theocracy and how this is so dangerous, indicative of the dangerous extremism of the right in America and the dangers of Christianity and how they need to be separated from the government in every way possible.
One of my more unhealthy habits is watching left-wing LGBTQ pastors talk about how Christianity is accepting of homosexuality and transgenderism, and that Jesus was really gay, and why there should be pride flags in churches and things like that. So on that note, I'm going to play a clip of a pastor talking about how Jesus had a male lover. So it's sacrilegious in the fact that Jesus had a lover and that lover was male.
Jesus had a same-gender lover, and I'm about to show you where. Gospel of John, chapter 13, verse 23. Jesus is hanging with his best bros, the disciples, at dinner one day when he tells them that one of them is going to betray him soon. Reclining on Jesus's bosom was one of his disciples, the man Jesus loved. Two important concepts: reclining and bosom. Reclining meant laying on one side, propped up on some pillows or an elbow. Actually, in other translations, it's better used as chest or lap. Jesus's lover had his head in Jesus's lap. Make of that what you will. The point of all of this, queer and trans people exist. We're here. We've always been here. We're in the sacred scriptures. Perhaps our God is queer and trans too. They can't erase us even from the text they use against us. Amen.
For audio, it's audio only, but this is an example of physiognomy being real, part 20,647, because that thing looks exactly like you think that thing would look like. We'll have to make it the thumbnail. And I hesitate to engage on the merits because this is a person who's clearly coming at this in bad faith. But it's not some obscure reference to faggotry. It's from a much more masculine time when male physical affection wasn't perceived necessarily as indicative of sexuality. In cultures less removed from the way of men than the 21st century Western world, physical affection among men is not inherently sexual in nature, and often is not. Most of the time it is not. Shouldn't be taken for granted that it is. Think a modern example of this where we can still see it is, say, in sports when football players slap each other on the ass. There's nothing sexual there, but there is physical affection being displayed. This exists in total isolation from roughly the rest of the entirety of Scripture when it comes to homosexuality. And then when it comes to the rest of the alphabet soup stuff, that was so far removed from what anyone even conceived of at the time that it's not mentioned, but we can presume with quite a bit of confidence that it would be condemned even more harshly than homosexuality, which resulted in entire populations being turned into pillars of salt. Explicitly too, and I just looked this up, John 13:23. In the original Greek, the word that is translated into the English versions as love is agape. So it is not eros, it's not sexual love, it is a godly affection, the highest form of love that humans are capable of expressing, a spiritual, selfless, magnanimous love, not erotic.
So to be honest, a lot of times I watch these videos for a laugh, but hearing Ness's description of that, it really is disturbing that this pastor would take a beautiful passage like that describes a very meaningful, deep relationship. And of course, when you add on what Jesus is soon to experience after expressing such deep love for his disciples and then being stabbed in the back by them and then denied by them, it's really disturbing that she would take something like that and twist it and for her own agenda of pushing deviant behavior that's in other passages, most notably, obviously in the Old Testament, but then of course in Paul's letters, a men having sex with men is just obviously a sinful activity.
You say disturbing. I don't disagree with that. I would use the word disgusting because I think that is the visceral reaction that it evokes at a more base level on top of the despicable, disgusting, anti-human sentiments that it expresses in trying to negate the very real, powerful sentiments you expressed there, Jeff. Her whole tone and demeanor is as irreverent and against nature as her scriptural understanding is against Christianity. And speaking of visceral reactions to things that are against nature, Allow me to use this as a gratuitous segue to shoehorn in one of my favorite audio clips in existence.
Studio this morning, one of the gay rights activists, Mr. Should I call you Mr? Pepe Julian Onzima. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you for
Good morning.
Morning to you.
Why are you gay?
Who says I'm gay?
You are gay. You are a transgender.
What shows that I'm gay?
You are a transgender, and you're a gay rights activist and an outspoken lesbian, homosexual. How can I describe you? Now, we're looking at the raging debate. You're a gay rights activist. Why should someone be gay? You're having a girlfriend.
Yes.
Do you perform the natural obligations?
I'm not sexually active right now.
So what are
By
you doing with
choice.
this lady?
By choice.
By choice?
Yeah. I've chosen not to engage.
Doesn't that make you gay?
What do you mean, doesn't that make me gay? I am male and attracted to a female.
So who is gay?
My base black brother's bemusement there is understandable for someone who is trying to wrestle with this for the first time. It used to be, at least in the Western world, I don't know for sub-Saharan Africa, where I believe this clip was taken from, but in the Western world, when I was growing up, the push was to embrace who you were and not be ashamed of it. And so if you were homosexual, then you were if you were a homosexual male, then you were a man who liked other men. But now it's sort of a perverse conversion therapy in reverse, where if you are a male who is attracted to men, you just say that you're a female and now you're attracted to men, and so you're no longer homosexual, you're straight now. Straight in the sense that in some way you're able to fornicate, but you are not able to procreate. And so it's the violations of the natural order are clear. They hit you right square in the face, and you can see that incongruity and tension being wrestled with by the host, who is asking very pointed, blatant questions that arise from the confusion that is the alphabet soup nonsense. Do you perform the natural obligation? Well, of course not, because it's not natural, but it does raise more questions about what exactly it means for a woman to have sex with another woman. You can take issue with the idea of a natural obligation existing. I use that phrase because the host used that phrase, but from an Enlightenment secular perspective, it does seem like it's a bit of a misnomer. We get to Hume's is versus ought problem when it comes to understanding morality, and if the Darwinian rules are the rules of the game, then it is to first survive and then secondly to procreate. And in that sense, as a biological entity, there is a sense that to some broad degree that it is your obligation to reproduce. And so the question, without realizing it, again, is a quite insightful one that he's asking. Rhetorically, I think, although I don't think he was asking it rhetorically. Maybe it's hard to tell. There's a lot of cultural boundaries there. But even if he was asking it in good faith, he could have also been asking it rhetorically, because he's asking if she performs the natural obligation, which of course she cannot, because she cannot procreate, at least not with a woman, no matter how hard she tries to present herself as a man. And that provides a segue into my other favorite audio clip in existence. This one is of Mark Robinson, the Lieutenant Governor of North Carolina and current gubernatorial candidate for the GOP in North Carolina for the election coming up in November. He initially was written off as having no chance of winning the election. He was down by like 10 points in the polls when he secured the Republican nomination, but more recent polling has him neck and neck with his Democratic competitor. Before I play the clip, in response to the accusation that I'm doing the typical white conservative thing in celebrating black men who will say things that white men won't. Perhaps there is some truth to that, whatever the veracity of that claim. I think I would just as strongly celebrate a white man who had the courage to say the same thing publicly, and also had the the same cover to say it publicly, because I do believe that this ties into what we started the show with the concept of white liberals and black rednecks. I am a white redneck, and so I have some affinity for black rednecks. And like many other white rednecks, I am envious to a certain degree, to a certain extent, of the ability of black rednecks to say the things that they say and live to tell about it.
Here's something else I'm not supposed to say. Ain't but two genders. Two genders. Ain't nothing but men and women. And I can already see WRL out there. They got they licking their pencils around, trying to write fierce as they can. Get every word of this here. Get every word of this. You can go to the doctor and get cut up. You can go down to the dress shop and get made up. You can go down there and get drugged up. But at the end of the day, you were just a drugged up, dressed up, made up, cut up, man or woman. You ain't changed what God put in you, that DNA. You can't transcend God's creation. I don't care how hard you try. The transgender movement in this country, if there's a movement in this country that is demonic and that is full of the spirit of Antichrist, it is the transgender movement. It's time for grown-ups and time for Christians to start standing up and being unafraid to tell the truth. Come after me if you want to. I don't care. You want my head? Here it is right here. Come on, come get it. I don't care, because it's time for us to stand up. And I'm not afraid to stand up and tell the truth about that issue. Been dragging our kids down into the pit of hell, trying to teach them that mess in our schools. Tell you like this, that ain't got no place at no school. 2 plus 2 don't equal transgender. It equals 4. You need to get back to teaching them how to read instead of teaching them how to go to hell.
Before we leave today, a little tease for something I'm working on in the future. I want to pose a question to Jeff. Do you think totally immersive simulations are physically possible?
Like VR?
In that direction, but totally submersive to the extent that you do not realize that you are in a simulation.
Yes, I believe that'll be possible someday.
And if you were designing such a simulation, one of the presumed attributes of the simulation is that to make it fully immersive and to make it more enjoyable and attractive, you would want it to be so convincingly real or seem so convincingly real that you wouldn't even realize that it was a simulation.
Agreed.
So if it's physically possible, and if it were to occur, you would not want to know, not be cognizant of the fact that it was a simulation. What are the chances now that you are not living in a simulation?
That's something that I would have to give a lot of thought to. I can't give a good, intelligent answer off the top of my head. But I would be very interested to hear your thoughts on that once you've had a chance to think through it.
I spend a lot of time managing probabilities, and with those parameters set, at least within the bounded rationality as we just laid it out there rhetorically, it's hard to conceive of the chance that if there are, or at least there would be the potential of infinite numbers of simulations, and definitionally those simulations would want to disguise themselves, the chances that we are in the one instance of a non-simulative experience, the only true one to exist in all of the universe or all of the multiverses, seems infinitesimally small. On the other hand, within the physics and the biology of the universe as we understand it, we appear to be the only place with intelligent life and carbon-based life forms, and that would also seem infinitesimally unlikely, and yet here we are. So perhaps it could be that we're on the cusp of a simulation revolution, or it could be a Fermi's paradox issue where we get to a certain point, or we begin to progress to a certain point where we might be headed towards some sort of multiverse experience, with simulations being able to be indistinguishable from the one true non-simulation, and the contradictions and the tensions and the incentive structures and everything else involved in that cause a collapse entirely. I, of course, don't know the answer, but I do know that it is something fascinating to think about.
I have had a feeling occasionally throughout my life, less so recently, but when I was younger, where I would have this, it's very difficult to articulate and I won't do a good job of it, but an almost a break from reality or seeing through the matrix moment where I felt like if it were a simulation, I was like briefly butting up against the algorithm, breaking through, where I would kind of see myself from afar, in a detached way.
From a third person perspective. Well, we could put this as a way to conceptualize the question. Think of it in video game terms, and that's like a latency issue or a perspective issue where something glitches for a moment. And even now, when gaming experiences or the virtual reality VR as it exists is not anywhere close to fully immersive in the technical sense of that term, it is very immersive when it comes to our own attention and our own mental bandwidth when playing a video game at a high level in a competitive, especially in a competitive format. It is not unusual to effectively block out or seem to block out everything else and just focus on what it is right in front of you, because you need every ounce of that mental concentration to manifest the best version of yourself. And so I don't think that the analogy to what we're talking about here is really that stretched, at least when it comes to conceptualizing what it is that we're thinking about and talking about and how we might understand it with the tools, the limited tools that we have in front of us here.
All right, we'll wrap it up there. Thanks for listening. Talk with you next time.